Take the test. The words landed with more force than the lawyer intended. A small white DNA kit slid across the polished walnut conference table, stopping directly in front of Hannah Pierce. For several seconds, no one moved. More than 50 members of the Romano family sat frozen beneath the crystal chandeliers of the estate's grand council room, staring at the curvy young housekeeper as though someone had suddenly invited a stranger onto a throne. Hannah blinked. "I'm sorry?" Her voice barely carried across the room. "I don't understand." The elderly attorney adjusted his glasses before opening another envelope, sealed with the late matriarch's personal crest. Mrs. Isabella Romano left one final legally binding instruction. He paused. No beneficiary will receive any portion of the Romano inheritance until Miss Hannah Pierce completes a DNA examination. The silence shattered instantly. This is insane. She's a servant. She's cleaned this house for 5 years. Throw her out. Insults crashed over one another until a chair scraped against the marble floor. Luciano Romano stood. America's youngest mafia boss didn't raise his voice. He simply picked up the DNA kit himself, then walked toward Hannah. She instinctively stepped backward. Why me?" Luciano looked directly into her frightened eyes. His answer drained every face in the room of color. "Because my mother believed you've been living in this house under a false name for 26 years. No one breathed. Not even Hannah. Because she had spent her entire life believing she was an unwanted orphan. Rain washed over the Romano estate as black luxury cars continued leaving through the wrought iron gates. Only hours had passed since Isabella Romano had been laid to rest. Even in death, she had commanded the respect of judges, senators, business magnates, union leaders, and men whose names never appeared in newspapers, but whose decisions quietly shaped entire cities. Now every member of the Romano bloodline had gathered inside the ancestral mansion to hear the final reading of her will. For everyone except Hannah Pierce, today was supposed to be another work day. She had risen before dawn, as she always did. She polished silver that nobody noticed, prepared coffee that nobody thanked her for, pressed black suits for men who barely remembered her name. She preferred it that way. Invisible people survived longer. At 26 years old, Hannah had spent nearly half a decade working inside the Romano estate. She knew which staircase creaked, which paintings hid security panels, which family members tipped generously, which ones deliberately left impossible messes because humiliating employees entertained them. None of that surprised her anymore. Being overlooked had become a kind of armor. She carried extra weight on her soft frame, something strangers often judged before hearing a single word she spoke. The cousins joked that she moved too slowly. The younger women mocked her plain uniforms. Some of the older relatives acted as though she were another piece of furniture. She accepted every slight with quiet professionalism. Because she needed the paycheck, because foster care had taught her that losing stability always hurt more than losing pride. Luciano Romano had rarely spoken more than a handful of words to her, not because he disliked her, because the head of the Romano organization barely noticed anyone outside his immediate circle. His life revolved around negotiations, legitimate corporations, security briefings, family politics, and carrying the impossible weight left behind by generations of Romanos before him. His mother had been different. Isabella remembered birthdays. She asked employees about sick relatives. She quietly increased salaries without making announcements. Sometimes she asked Hannah to stay after dinner simply to share tea in the private greenhouse overlooking the western gardens. They never discussed business. They talked about flowers, books, old recipes. Once, Isabella had looked at Hannah for an unusually long time before softly asking, "Has anyone ever told you that your eyes remind them of someone?" Hannah laughed awkwardly. No, madam. The older woman smiled sadly. I suppose they wouldn't. Hannah never understood what she meant. Until today. Inside the council chamber, Attorney Charles Whitmore carefully unfolded another handwritten page. I have already distributed the financial instructions, he said. What remains concerns a private matter that Madame Romano insisted be read in front of every living beneficiary. The room grew still. Whitmore continued. If Hannah Pierce refuses the DNA examination, every inheritance enters an indefinite legal trust. A wave of disbelief swept across the room. Luciano's uncle rose first. This borders on insanity. Another cousin slammed his palm against the table. She's manipulating us from the grave. Someone pointed toward Hannah. Get the girl out. Hannah wished someone would. She wanted to disappear. She had no idea why her name had become the center of the most powerful family's greatest legal battle. Luciano remained standing. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't watching Hannah. He was watching the lawyer. My mother never acted without preparation, he said quietly. If she wrote this, she already expected today's reaction. Whitmore nodded. She did. Then he reached beneath the table and produced a thick leather archive box tied with crimson ribbon. I was instructed not to open these documents unless Miss Pierce completed the DNA test. Every conversation stopped. Luciano stared at the weathered box. His mother had hidden many secrets over the years, but never from him. At least, that was what he had always believed. Across the room, Hannah looked down at the unopened DNA kit, resting in her trembling hands. For reasons she couldn't explain, an old memory surfaced. She was perhaps 4 years old. A woman's voice. The scent of roses. Someone fastening a tiny gold locket around her neck. Then flashing blue lights. Rain. Crying. After that, nothing. The memory vanished as quickly as it appeared. She pressed her fingers against her temple. Why was she remembering something she had forgotten for more than 20 years? And why had Isabella Romano seemed almost unsurprised every time she looked into Hannah's eyes? No one left the conference room. The afternoon sunlight faded behind heavy storm clouds, leaving the Romano mansion wrapped in an uneasy gray silence. Attorney Whitmore carefully placed the unopened leather archive back onto the table. It remains sealed, he reminded everyone, until the DNA results are verified. Luciano folded his arms. How long? An expedited laboratory can provide legally admissible results within 24 hours. 24 hours. To most families, it was a simple delay. To the Romanos, it felt like an eternity. Millions of dollars in businesses, shipping companies, hotels, vineyards, investment firms, and generations of influence now sat frozen because of a frightened housekeeper who looked as though she wanted to disappear through the marble floor. Hannah swallowed. I don't want anyone's money. No one answered. One of Luciano's older cousins laughed coldly. That's exactly what someone says before asking for half the estate. Another woman sneered. She probably planned this with the old woman. The accusation struck Hannah harder than she expected. I never asked Madame Romano for anything. You expect us to believe that? I barely spoke to anyone outside the kitchen. Another burst of mocking laughter echoed through the room. Luciano finally turned. Enough. His voice never rose. It didn't need to. Silence returned immediately. He looked at Hannah for several long seconds, not with suspicion, with calculation. During 5 years inside his home, she had never once been involved in gossip, never stolen, never complained, never tried to gain favors. His security reports described her as painfully ordinary, almost invisible. If she had somehow manipulated his mother, she had hidden it better than professional intelligence officers. That alone seemed unlikely. Whitmore slid the DNA authorization papers across the table. Miss Pierce, you may still refuse. Hannah stared at the documents. Her fingers trembled. "I don't even know what I'm agreeing to," Luciano answered before the lawyer could. "Neither do we." The honesty surprised her. For the first time since entering the mansion, someone admitted they were just as confused. She slowly nodded. "If taking this test ends all of this, I'll do it." The room erupted again. Someone cursed. Someone stormed toward the door. Luciano ignored every protest. Within minutes, a private medical technician, employed by the Romano Foundation, arrived carrying a sterile evidence case. Every movement followed strict legal procedure. Photographs, identification, witness signatures, security seals. The technician swabbed the inside of Hannah's cheek, then Luciano's. A cousin immediately objected. "Why him?" Whitmore calmly replied. "Madame Romano specifically requested comparison with her son's genetic profile." Another wave of uneasy whispers spread across the room. Luciano himself showed almost no reaction. Yet one sentence repeated endlessly inside his mind. "My mother believed you've been living under a false name. Not suspected." Believed. There was certainty hidden inside those words. His mother had never dealt in guesses. When the technician finally sealed both samples, armed security officers personally escorted the evidence to a waiting helicopter bound for Manhattan. No one trusted ordinary mail where the Romano family was concerned. As the aircraft disappeared beyond the trees, Hannah quietly slipped away toward the servants' quarters. She desperately needed air. The mansion suddenly felt unfamiliar. Every hallway seemed to watch her. Every portrait appeared to judge her. Inside the small room she had called home for years, she sat on the edge of her neatly made bed. Everything she owned fit inside one modest wardrobe. 2 uniforms. 3 dresses. A box of old photographs from foster care. 1 cracked ceramic mug. 1 tiny gold locket she had worn since childhood. She reached automatically for the necklace resting beneath her collar. The clasp had almost rusted shut over the years. She had never managed to open it. The social workers told her it was probably worthless. The orphanage records listed only a few facts. Female, approximately 4 years old. Found after a traffic accident. No surviving relatives identified. Temporary name assigned. Later renamed Hannah Pierce. Nothing else. She had stopped asking questions years ago. Sometimes, surviving required accepting that some answers would never come. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She quickly stood. Luciano remained outside the doorway. "I won't come in unless you invite me." She hesitated before stepping aside. The head of the Romano Empire entered the tiny servant's room and looked around quietly. His eyes paused on the narrow bed, the worn furniture, the patched curtains. The tiny bookshelf filled with second-hand novels. 5 years. She had lived inside his estate, with almost nothing. He felt unexpectedly uncomfortable. "My mother knew where you lived." Hannah nodded. "She offered me a larger room several times. Why didn't you accept?" She smiled faintly. This one was enough. Luciano had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without feeling emotionally unsettled. Yet standing inside this simple room proved strangely difficult. His mother had trusted this woman, not because of status, not because of beauty, not because of obligation, simply because she believed Hannah deserved kindness. "What do you remember about your childhood?" he asked. She looked down. "Almost nothing." "Any family?" "No." "Names?" She slowly shook her head. "Faces come back sometimes." "Mostly dreams." "What kind of dreams?" She hesitated. "A woman singing. A garden. A little white horse. And..." She touched the necklace around her neck. "This." Luciano's attention immediately settled on the old gold locket. "May I see it?" She unclasped the chain and handed it over. Years of wear had faded the gold. One corner carried an engraved symbol, almost invisible beneath scratches. Luciano froze. He had seen that crest before. Not on jewelry. Not in museums. Inside his mother's private study. On an old family document, dated more than 25 years earlier. His pulse quickened. Before he could examine it further, someone knocked urgently. "Boss!" His chief of security stood outside. "We've finished searching the late madam's private office." Luciano looked up. "And we found an empty safe." "Empty?" "Except for one missing file." "What file?" The guard swallowed. "We don't know. But according to the inventory, it disappeared sometime before Madame Romano passed away." Luciano slowly closed his hand around Hannah's forgotten locket. For the first time that day, he wondered whether someone else already knew exactly who Hannah Pierce really was. Luciano didn't sleep that night. The old gold locket rested on his desk beneath a single reading lamp, while rain tapped steadily against the mansion's tall windows. He had dismissed everyone except the head of security and Attorney Whitmore. Neither man spoke. They simply watched as Luciano opened an archive cabinet built into the wall of his late mother's private office. Very few people had ever entered this room. Even fewer knew how meticulously Isabella Romano documented the family's history. Every marriage, every birth, every death, every alliance, every betrayal. Nothing escaped her records. Luciano removed several leather-bound volumes before finally finding what he had been searching for. A thin folder marked only with one handwritten date. May 14, 26 years earlier. He slowly opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings, police reports, hospital admission forms, photographs. The first image showed hundreds of people gathered outside St. Catherine's Cathedral. Attorney Whitmore adjusted his glasses. "I remember that day." "So do I," Luciano replied quietly. "It was my 6th birthday." His mother had hosted a massive charity gala for children's hospitals. Every major political figure in New York had attended. The newspapers called it the social event of the year. Luciano remembered balloons, music, his mother laughing. He also remembered something else, the celebration ending suddenly, adults whispering. Security guards running through the estate, his mother crying for the first and only time he had ever witnessed. As a child, nobody explained why. The adults simply told him there had been an emergency. Now he looked down at the next document. Missing Child Investigation. His heartbeat slowed. A little girl's photograph stared back at him, approximately 4 years old, dark hair, large brown eyes, a soft, round face. Luciano instinctively reached for Hannah's employment file lying beside him. He placed the childhood photograph next to Hannah's identification picture. No one spoke. The resemblance wasn't perfect. 22 years separated the images, but the eyes, they were unmistakably similar. Whitmore inhaled sharply. My God. Luciano continued reading. The missing child had disappeared during the charity event, after briefly wandering away from the estate gardens. Despite an investigation involving state police, federal agents, and private security, no trace of her had ever been found. The case eventually went cold. Luciano frowned. Who was she? Whitmore hesitated, then quietly answered, Your cousin. Luciano looked up. My cousin, the daughter of your mother's younger sister. He blinked. I never had an aunt. You did. The lawyer's expression darkened. But she died 6 months after her daughter disappeared. Luciano stared at him. No one ever told me. Because Madame Romano forbade anyone from speaking about it. The room fell silent again. Another folder emerged from the archive. This one contained a faded birth certificate. The child's original name read, Helena Rose Romano. Luciano slowly repeated it aloud. Helena. He closed his eyes. Something stirred inside his memory. Years ago, perhaps 15 years earlier, he had overheard his mother talking to herself inside the greenhouse. She had whispered one sentence, "I'll find you, Helena." At the time, he assumed she had been remembering an old friend. Now, everything sounded different. Across the mansion, Hannah lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her tiny room. Sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, fragments returned. A white horse, a woman with gentle hands, a song, always the same melody. She softly hummed it without realizing. Outside her door, old Mrs. Evelyn, the retired cook who still lived on the estate, stopped walking. Her tray nearly slipped from her hands. She knew that lullaby. She hadn't heard it in 26 years. Slowly, she knocked. "Hannah?" The young woman opened the door. "I'm sorry if I woke you." Mrs. Evelyn stared at her. "Where did you learn that song?" Hannah looked confused. "I don't know. I've always remembered it." The elderly woman slowly sat down. Her hands trembled. Madame Isabella used to sing that exact lullaby. Every evening, to only one child. Hannah frowned. "What child?" Mrs. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "Little Helena." The room suddenly felt too small. "I'm sure there are lots of children with that name." No, there weren't. The song wasn't famous. Madame Isabella wrote it herself. Hannah's breathing became uneven. "That's impossible. I've never met her before working here." Mrs. Evelyn carefully reached into her apron pocket. "I've kept something for years." She unfolded an old photograph. Time had faded its edges almost white. It showed Isabella Romano kneeling in a flower garden beside a smiling little girl holding a tiny white wooden horse. Hannah's hand froze. The toy. She knew that toy. Not because she had seen the picture, because she remembered carrying it. A sharp pain exploded behind her eyes. Suddenly another memory surfaced. A man lifting her into a dark sedan. Someone shouting. Her tiny hands reaching toward a woman running across the garden. Then, nothing. She gasped and nearly fell. Mrs. Evelyn caught her before she hit the floor. At that exact moment, Luciano entered the hallway, carrying Helena Romano's childhood file. He stopped. The photograph slipped slightly from his fingers, because the old cook was holding another photograph. The same child, the same garden, the same white horse. Luciano slowly walked closer. Without saying a word, he placed the official police photograph beside the one Mrs. Evelyn had protected for decades. Every face in both pictures matched. Every detail matched. Except one. Around little Helena's neck hung the exact same gold locket Hannah had worn every single day since arriving at the Romano estate. No one in the hallway said a word, because for the first time, the impossible no longer looked impossible. It looked frighteningly real. Yet one question still remained unanswered. If Hannah truly was Helena Romano, who had stolen her? And why had they allowed her to return to the Romano estate years later as nothing more than an invisible housekeeper? The Romano estate had never felt so quiet. Not after gang wars, not after federal investigations, not even after Isabella Romano's funeral. 24 hours had passed. Every member of the Romano family had returned to the mansion. No one came because they wanted to. They came because millions of dollars, and perhaps the future of the Romano Empire, remained frozen until Attorney Whitmore opened one single envelope. Outside, television vans gathered beyond the estate gates. The media knew something unusual was happening. They simply didn't know what. Inside the council chamber, no one spoke. Hannah stood near the back of the room. She wore the same simple black uniform she had always worn. She had offered to prepare coffee that morning. Mrs. Evelyn had gently taken the tray from her hands. "Not today, sweetheart. You've served this family long enough." Those words had nearly brought Hannah to tears. She still didn't understand why everyone looked at her differently. Some with curiosity, some with fear, others with open hatred. Luciano entered precisely at 10 o'clock. He nodded once toward Whitmore. The attorney broke the laboratory seal. Every eye followed the movement. He removed several certified documents, read the first page silently, then stopped. His hands trembled. Luciano noticed immediately. Charles. The lawyer slowly looked up. I've represented the Romano family for 43 years. His voice had become almost unrecognizable. I never imagined I would read these words. One of Luciano's uncles slammed his fist onto the table. For God's sake, stop building suspense. Whitmore ignored him. Instead, he read directly from the laboratory report. Sample A, Miss Hannah Pierce. Sample B, reference material obtained from Mr. Luciano Romano through maternal lineage. Another pause. Then, the probability that Hannah Pierce belongs to the direct Romano maternal bloodline exceeds, he swallowed, 99.9998%. Silence. Absolute silence. It lasted almost 10 full seconds. No one breathed. One cousin suddenly laughed. No. Another shook his head. The laboratory made a mistake. A woman stood abruptly. Run the test again. Whitmore calmly lifted another document. They already did. 3 independent analyses. 3 different laboratories. All reached the identical conclusion. The room exploded. Half the family began shouting at once. Some demanded fraud investigations. Others accused Whitmore of conspiracy. Several demanded Hannah leave immediately. One elderly relative quietly crossed himself. Luciano never took his eyes off Hannah. She hadn't moved. She hadn't smiled. She hadn't celebrated. She simply stared at the report as though it belonged to someone else. I don't understand, she whispered. I'm just Hannah. Whitmore slowly lowered the papers. No, you were told you were Hannah. Those are not the same thing. Another envelope remained unopened. The crimson seal bearing Isabella Romano's personal crest had never been broken. Whitmore carefully placed it in the center of the table. This may only be opened after positive DNA confirmation. Luciano broke the wax seal himself. Inside rested a handwritten letter, his mother's handwriting. Steady, elegant, familiar, he began reading aloud. If this letter has been opened, then the child I failed to protect has finally come home. No one interrupted. Luciano continued. Helena, if you are reading these words, then I have already left this world, and for that, I ask your forgiveness. Hannah's knees weakened. Mrs. Evelyn quietly moved beside her. 26 years ago, someone inside our own family betrayed us. You were not lost by accident. You were taken. The room became impossibly still. Luciano kept reading. I spent the rest of my life searching for you. I hired investigators on 3 continents. I followed every false lead, every rumor, every anonymous phone call, every child who looked remotely like you. His voice became rough. Then 5 years ago, you walked into this house asking for work. Several relatives looked toward Hannah in disbelief. Luciano's own hands tightened around the paper. I recognized your eyes immediately. But recognition is not proof. If I had accused the wrong people without evidence, the true conspirators would have disappeared forever. Another page followed. So I waited. I watched. I protected you from a distance. I arranged for you to work only inside the main residence. I instructed the staff that no one was ever to dismiss you, regardless of circumstance. Hannah covered her mouth. Every promotion she had quietly received. Every time another supervisor tried transferring her. Every unexplained decision that had kept her inside the Romano estate. It had never been luck. Isabella had been protecting her all along. Luciano turned to the final page. His heartbeat quickened before reading the last paragraph. Luciano, if Helena has been found, never trust anyone who demands this inheritance be settled quickly, because the person responsible for stealing her is almost certainly still sitting inside this room. The words echoed through the chamber. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed willing to breathe. Every family member slowly began looking at everyone else. Brothers studied brothers. Wives looked at husbands. Cousins stepped subtly away from one another. Luciano folded the letter. His face had become unreadable. The DNA mystery had ended. A far more dangerous investigation had just begun. Before anyone could speak, the massive oak doors burst open. The head of estate security rushed inside. "Boss, what is it?" The surveillance team reviewing the archived estate recordings found something. "What?" The guard looked directly at Hannah. "Someone has been secretly photographing Miss Pierce for years." The room fell silent again. And the oldest photographs. They were taken before she ever started working here. Luciano slowly stood. That meant only one thing. Whoever had kidnapped Helena Romano had never truly lost track of her. They had been watching, waiting, for 26 years. No one left the council chamber. Not after the letter. Not after the surveillance photographs. Not after learning that someone had secretly monitored Hannah for years. Luciano slowly spread dozens of photographs across the conference table. Some showed Hannah leaving the grocery store. Others captured her walking to church on Sunday mornings. Several had been taken outside the foster home where she lived, before joining the Romano estate. The oldest photograph stopped everyone cold. Hannah looked no older than 8. She was sitting alone on a playground swing. Someone had photographed her from behind a chain-link fence. Attorney Whitmore looked pale. That child had already disappeared from every official investigation. Luciano nodded. Yet someone still knew exactly where she was. He looked around the room. That means this wasn't a random kidnapping. It was maintenance. No one understood. Luciano continued. Whoever took Helena didn't abandon her. They erased her. They controlled how she grew up. They watched her. They made certain she never discovered who she really was. The silence settled over the room. His chief of security entered carrying another folder. We finished reviewing Madame Isabella's private investigation. Luciano opened it. The first page listed only 3 names. 3 people Isabella had secretly investigated during the final years of her life. His uncle, a distant cousin, and one name that surprised everyone. Richard Holloway. The Romano family's longtime financial advisor. Whitmore frowned. Richard worked for your father. For nearly 30 years. Luciano's expression hardened. And according to my mother, he was never fully trusted. Another page revealed dozens of financial transfers, shell companies, offshore trusts, consulting fees. Most appeared legitimate, until Luciano noticed one date, exactly 1 week after Helena disappeared, a payment of $2 million. Recipient: Northbridge Children's Services. Hannah stared at the page. My foster agency. Every head turned toward her. You recognize it? She nodded slowly. I lived in one of their homes. For years. Luciano felt something cold settle inside his chest. A private children's agency. A missing heiress. An erased identity. Money changing hands immediately after the kidnapping. The pieces no longer looked unrelated. They bought silence, he said quietly. Just then, another guard hurried into the room. Boss! The laboratory called. Luciano looked up. I thought the testing was finished. It is. But one of the technicians became suspicious. He handed over another sealed report. This wasn't only a relationship analysis. They also ran ancestry markers. Luciano opened the document. His eyes narrowed, then narrowed again. Whitmore watched his expression change. "What is it?" Luciano slowly looked toward Hannah. "This report confirms she is Helena Romano." Everyone already knew that. Then Luciano turned another page. "It also proves something else." He paused. "She isn't simply another beneficiary." He laid the report on the table. "She carries the oldest surviving maternal bloodline of the Romano family." Confused whispers spread across the room. Whitmore understood first. His face turned white. "My God." Luciano nodded. "My mother was never the legal owner of the family trust. The trust always followed the eldest surviving maternal descendant." He looked directly at Hannah. If Helena had never disappeared, the controlling interest in every Romano holding would legally belong to her. The room erupted. One cousin overturned his chair. Another shouted that the documents were forged. Several relatives began arguing over decades-old succession rules. Hannah stepped backward. "I don't want any of this." Nobody listened. They were no longer looking at a housekeeper. They were looking at billions of dollars. Luciano watched the room carefully. Fear revealed character. Several relatives appeared angry. Others appeared desperate. One man, Richard Holloway, appeared terrified. Luciano noticed it instantly. While everyone else argued, Richard quietly reached into his jacket. Not for a weapon, for his phone. He typed a message, then tried slipping toward the side exit. Luciano spoke without raising his voice. "Richard." The older man froze. "Leaving already?" Richard forced a smile. "I thought this meeting was finished." "It isn't." Luciano nodded toward two security officers. "Please ask Mr. Holloway to stay." The advisor laughed nervously. "This is becoming ridiculous." It became ridiculous 26 years ago. Luciano extended his hand. "Your phone." Richard hesitated. "No." The room became silent again. Luciano's eyes never left him. "I wasn't asking." Richard suddenly pushed one guard aside and sprinted toward the rear hallway. He almost reached the exit. Almost. 3 security officers tackled him before he touched the door. His phone slid across the marble floor. Luciano picked it up. The last outgoing message had been sent less than 30 seconds earlier. "Destroy everything." No recipient name, only an encrypted number. Luciano handed the device to his cybersecurity chief. "Recover every deleted message." Richard stopped struggling. His shoulders slowly collapsed. For the first time in decades. He looked old, very old. Luciano crouched beside him. "My mother spent 26 years looking for Helena." He spoke almost gently. "You spent 26 years making sure she never found the truth." Richard closed his eyes. "You don't understand." "Then help me." A long silence followed. Finally, Richard whispered the words that froze everyone in the room. "I didn't order the kidnapping. I only cleaned it up." Every person inside the Romano mansion went completely still. Because if Richard hadn't planned the crime, then someone even more powerful had. And that person had still not been identified. The council chamber remained silent. Richard Holloway sat handcuffed between 2 security officers, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Luciano stood over him. "If you didn't order the kidnapping, who did?" Richard stared at the marble floor. For nearly a minute, he refused to answer. Then he whispered, "Your grandfather." Every person in the room froze. Luciano's jaw tightened. "My grandfather died 20 years ago." "I know." Richard slowly nodded. But the order was his. He closed his eyes as though reliving a memory that had haunted him for decades. "Your grandfather believed the Romano Empire needed one unquestioned heir. After your aunt gave birth to Helena, he feared the inheritance laws would divide control of the family forever. He called it protecting the empire." Hannah could barely breathe. Richard continued. He never wanted the child killed. He only wanted her removed. A new identity, a new life, no connection to the Romanos. Attorney Whitmore shook his head in disbelief. So an innocent child lost her family. Because powerful men wanted simpler paperwork. Richard's voice cracked. I tried to convince myself I was protecting everyone. But every year, it became another lie. Luciano slowly looked toward the portrait of his grandfather, hanging above the fireplace. For decades he had admired the man who built the Romano Empire. Now that legacy looked very different. He removed the portrait from the wall himself. Without anger, without ceremony, he leaned it face first against the marble floor. His name ends today. No one objected, because no one could. Just then, the cybersecurity chief hurried into the chamber. We recovered the deleted messages. Luciano accepted the tablet. The conversation revealed everything. For years, Richard had quietly paid private investigators to ensure Hannah never discovered her origins. Whenever she changed jobs, he knew. Whenever she moved, he knew. When she applied to work at the Romano estate, he attempted to stop the hiring. Luciano frowned, but she was hired anyway. Mrs. Evelyn smiled through tears. Madame Isabella overruled everyone. I remember exactly what she said. The elderly cook closed her eyes. Sometimes the people meant to come home, find their own way. Hannah finally understood. Every unexpected kindness, every unexplained opportunity, every moment Isabella had looked at her with quiet sadness. She had known. She simply lacked the proof to tell the world. Luciano walked toward Hannah. The room instinctively made space for him. She looked down. I don't know how to be Helena. You don't have to. His answer came immediately. You survived without this family. You owe us nothing. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I spent my whole life wondering why nobody wanted me. Luciano gently shook his head. That was never the truth. The truth is, someone stole you from the people who loved you. For the first time in 26 years. Hannah cried not because she felt abandoned, but because she finally understood she never had been. Several weeks later, the Romano estate opened its gates once again. This time, not for a funeral, not for a legal hearing, but for a public announcement. Journalists from across the country gathered outside the mansion. Luciano stood before dozens of cameras. Beside him stood Hannah. She no longer wore a housekeeper's uniform. Instead, she chose a simple navy blue dress. Elegant, modest, entirely her own. Luciano addressed the press. Today we are correcting a crime committed against one child 26 years ago. He paused. The Romano family officially recognizes Helena Rose Romano. Reporters shouted questions. Was she taking control of the family trust? Would leadership change? Was the empire facing internal conflict? Hannah stepped toward the microphone before Luciano could answer. I didn't come here looking for wealth. I came here looking for the truth. She smiled softly. And today, I found my family. Across the crowd, Mrs. Evelyn quietly wiped away tears. Even Attorney Whitmore smiled. Justice had arrived, not through revenge, but through truth. Months passed. The Romano Foundation announced a new initiative, funding missing child investigations and foster care support across the country. The first building carried Isabella Romano's name. The second carried Helena's. Hannah insisted on visiting every new program herself. She never forgot what loneliness felt like. Luciano often accompanied her, not as a bodyguard. Not as the feared head of a criminal dynasty, but simply as the man who understood that power meant very little unless it protected someone. One evening, they returned to Isabella's greenhouse. The roses had begun blooming again. Hannah smiled. This is where she used to drink tea with me. Luciano nodded. I always wondered why she disappeared every Thursday afternoon. They laughed quietly. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Luciano looked toward her. My mother believed people were defined by what they chose after learning the truth. And what do you choose? Hannah looked across the gardens where she had once worked unnoticed, carrying trays no one remembered. She smiled. I choose not to let the worst thing that happened to me become the thing that defines me. Luciano smiled back. I think she'd be proud. He didn't rush to take her hand. Neither of them rushed anything. Some relationships are built in a single dramatic moment. Others grow from trust patiently earned. Theirs belonged to the second kind. The empire survived, not because it protected power, but because, at last, it protected the right person. And perhaps that was the final lesson Isabella Romano had spent 26 years trying to leave behind. Sometimes, the greatest inheritance isn't money. It is the courage to restore someone's name. If this story moved you, remember that the greatest acts of courage often begin with a single person choosing to uncover the truth instead of protecting a comfortable lie. What moment touched you the most? When Hannah discovered her true identity, or when Luciano chose justice over family legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy emotional mafia dramas filled with hidden identities, unforgettable twists, and slow-burn relationships built on trust, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story.